Welcome to Casual Friday. In this week's Casual Friday podcast, I have tidbits, I have a finished project, and I have an update on my 1940s vintage sweater project. Plus, I have this week's installment of Finish It February preparations, where we'll address that pile of ambiguity. So let's get started. This first tidbit is actually a local event to those of you who live here in the Twin Cities. It is called Strikkekos, which is Norwegian for the feeling of coziness and conviviality that comes with contented knitting, also the act itself. So this is an exhibit at the Norway House, which is on Franklin Avenue. It started on January 22nd and continues through February 20th. And the description of the event is that Norway has a long, rich history of warm knits and fiber art. Strikkekos is an expression of our love for the knitters in our community, featuring around 30 different Norwegian and Nordic mitten styles made by volunteer knitters from across the Midwest. This exhibit, co-curated with resident knitting mistress Karen Weiberg, who is a part of a weekly knitting group at Norway House, is based on mitten designs from Nina Granlund Sather's book, Mittens from Around Norway. Each pair of mittens will be displayed along with information about the pattern. I actually know Karen Weiberg, so when I saw her name in there, I was like, oh yeah, I know her. She used to own a yarn shop here in town called Three Kittens. It still exists. She just sold it to a new set of owners. She's very active in the textile community here. I often see her volunteering at the Textile Center Library when I go in there to check out books. So I've known her for years. So this is an event that I was interested in going to, a little nervous about because of COVID. But in Minneapolis, we do have a mask mandate, so you have to be masked if you are in indoor locations. And as well, in order to get into a Norway House, in order to see the exhibit, you have to show proof of vaccination or a COVID test 72 hours prior. So one of the interesting things about this is that there isn't a cost of admission into the exhibit. It doesn't cost anything to go to Norway House, but there is a cost of admission, $5, but kids 12 and under are free and members are free. And if you bring a pair of mittens to the exhibit, you can get in free. So you can either ask to include your mittens as part of the exhibit, and they'll ask you to give some information about it, or you can just bring mittens to donate. They are going to be donating to an organization our guild did service knitting for last year called Hats and Mittens, and they give hats and mittens to children and their families who are in need. So if you are interested, I'll leave a link down to the website where you can find out all of the exact information about dates and times and location, etc. I think I got this next tidbit from my Twitter feed. If somebody sent this to me directly, I apologize. I'm trying to create a system to track things better all over for tidbits because I do get a lot of links from people now, and sometimes they're things I've already covered, but sometimes they're new things, and I'm just trying to keep it all manageable and also keep a variety each week that I present to you. So again, if you sent this to me, I apologize. This is an article in Sapiens magazine, which is an anthropology magazine, and it's about sewing needles. It's sewing needles reveal the roots of fashion. So what they discovered was this area in Siberia where the climate has been cold for millennia. They know that there were Stone Age people living in that area 50,000 years ago. And the only way for humans to survive in those conditions would be if they had clothing. And so they have found in different sites sewing needles that are 20,000 years old or older. And these needles actually have eyes in them, so they could have been threaded. And the other thing that they are figuring out is that they weren't just used to sew clothing together. They were also used to embellish things with embroidery or other decorations, so that fashion was really part of their the thing that they did with clothing. They weren't just clothing themselves to keep warm. The article's pretty short, but they do reference an actual study that was done that was published in another journal. So if you are more interested in that, you can follow the trail to learn more about ancient sewing needles. This tidbit came to me from Vishpala on Twitter, who shared a link to an article about the upcoming Beijing Olympics. What that link explains is that Olympians are going to receive bouquets of cashmere hand-knitted flowers rather than fresh flowers when they are on the podium. So the idea is to promote sustainability, and the article said the knitted bouquet will mimic 6 real types of flowers: roses, Chinese roses, lilies of the valley, hydrangeas, laurel, and olive branches. So according to their press release, the chosen flowers symbolize friendship, tenacity, happiness, unity, victory, and peace. So I will leave a link down below. What this article does not mention is who these people are who are doing the knitting. I would be really interested to know who the knitters are, and just a little bit more about whoever's idea it was and how they decided on these flowers. So if anybody knows about more information about the origins of this idea and also the people who are doing the actual work of knitting these flowers, I would love to know more. This tidbit came to me from Carol Tidy, Blackwater Vintage Knits, on Instagram. And it's a link to an article that was first published in Piecework Magazine back in 2011. And that article was adapted from a lecture that the author gave in 2008 at the In the Loop conference in the UK. And it's the social history of a knitting pattern from her family. So the pattern was a glove pattern that was published during or around the time of World War II. And it was used by her mother and her grandmother. It was used to teach her to knit when her family moved halfway around the world, and they were in a place where there wasn't access to much in the way of knitting patterns, and she was teaching a friend to knit. Her family sent that knitting package of patterns, including that glove pattern there. And so it just extended across multiple generations and expanded out to include friends and other family members. And I found it really interesting to read about, and the stories that she had to tell. I'd be interested if any of you have similar stories about patterns that get passed down. I certainly have my grandmother's knitting patterns. I was a knitter when she died, and so I wanted all of her knitting tools and books and things. And mostly I just kept those for sentimental reasons, because these were mostly patterns from the 60s and 70s. Things like yellow knitted, what we would in the US would call knickers, which are pants that go, not underpants, but pants that go down below the knee and buckle, like nothing I would knit nowadays. So like there was nothing that I would want to knit from those patterns that I got from my grandmother, but I just love having them because I can see the things that she knit for us when I was a child in those books, and also see little notes that she wrote as well. But I'd be interested if any of you have patterns that you have inherited from other family members, and if you actually have used those patterns currently to make things for the next generation. This final tidbit is more of a big bite than a tidbit. There's a bit more information in this one. It came from First Horse, who created a discussion thread on Ravelry and posted this information they had gotten in an email from Yad Vashem, which is the World Holocaust Remembrance Center. Museums will sometimes have a post about an item in their collection, and then they'll give you a little bit of information about it. And so the information was a picture of this sweater, and then a picture of the woman who knit it, showing her wearing it after the war. The heading was "Sweater that Gusha Wald Bloom knitted in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp using 2 wooden sticks and wool unraveled from the socks of German soldiers. And then there's just a couple of paragraphs. One paragraph basically reiterates what was in the heading, that Gusia Wald Bloom, a young Polish survivor, knitted herself a sweater in Bergen-Belsen DP camp using the unraveled wool of German soldiers' socks. She fashioned a new life and identity for herself. And then they give a little bit of biographical information that she was born in Tomaszów Mazowiecki, Poland in 1926, was confined in the ghetto with her parents and siblings. And then they kind of gave a chain of events like what labor camps she was in. And in January 1945, Auschwitz prisoners were sent on the infamous death marches, and Gusia thus reached the Bergen-Belsen camp where she was liberated. I had so many questions, and so I contacted Yad Vashem and said, do you have more information? I'm so curious about the sweater and the woman who knitted it. Like, how did she get those socks that she then used to knit the sweater? And it was a very fashionable 1940s sweater. And I was just trying to create a timeline of when she would have been able to knit this, like physically able to knit this, and how she got the materials and how she created the tools as well. And when I sent my question in, they said it could take, they're very busy, and it might take a little while to hear back. I think it was less than a week that an archivist emailed me back and said, and explained a little bit more about it, and then gave me all of the information that her daughters had supplied when they were giving the information with the sweater and the photograph. And it turns out there was quite a lot of information that just went over my head when I first saw this. I knew about Bergen-Belsen as a concentration camp. I wasn't understanding the distinction between that and Bergen-Belsen DP camp. So based on the information that they gave me, here is the timeline. So Gusia was born on September 6, 1926. In November of 1940, so she just would have barely been 14 years old, she was arrested and sent to the Tomaszów ghetto. So the city where she was living, she was sent to the Jewish ghetto, and she worked hard forced labor in the sewing workshop and received little food allowance. In 1942, her entire family was transported except for her. So her brother David was older and married with a couple of kids. He had been transported, they think, to Treblinka earlier in the year. But at the end of October in 1942, her sisters and her parents were transported, and she was left there. So she was just turned 16, and her entire family was transported, and she was left in the labor camp. In June of 1943, so the next spring, she's still 16 years old, she was transferred to a forced labor camp in Bleijen, I think is how it's pronounced, where she worked in a laundromat and later in a knitting-related fact is what the information says. I'm not sure what that means, but it does indicate that she was doing something with knitting. In July 1944, so she would have been 17 years old, she was sent to Auschwitz. She worked there building a railway, and then in January 1945, so just after she turned 18, she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she also worked in forced labor and rarely received food. At one point, she reached exhaustion and was sent to Block 215 along with over 1,000 other women. I'm not sure the significance of Block 215 other than it's a piece of information that is known. She was liberated by the British Army on April 15th, 1945. So she got to Bergen-Belsen in January, and the camp was liberated in 1945. Here's the piece of information that suddenly made me understand and be able to research more. She remained in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp until 1948, where she attended Ort School and received a diploma in sewing for women in May of 1947. So ORT is the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training. It's vocational training schools organized occupational education. The difference between Bergen-Belsen and Bergen-Belsen DP camp is that when the British liberated Bergen-Belsen, they burned down the barracks because they were completely unsanitary, and they moved the people who had been imprisoned in that camp to a nearby former German army base. And that's where they set up the camp for displaced persons. So these were people who, after the war, they may have lost their entire family. The villages or towns where they were from, their homes or the entire village may have been destroyed. In some cases, people did attempt to return home, and then they were killed in a pogrom post-war. So there were a lot of reasons people either couldn't return or didn't want to return. Your family is your home. And if your family isn't there and the physical location isn't there, what is there for you to return to? So these were displaced persons. So a lot of people did immigrate to other countries, but many people did not. And she was one of them. That's where those soldier socks came from, is that it was a German army base and those were left behind. And so that's where she got the materials. And they did say they know that she made the needles from wood that she found at the camp, but they don't know anything else about it. But I imagine if there was vocational training there, there was this Ort school, there may have been tools that she could have had access to in order to make those. When the people were moved from Bergen-Belsen prison camp and then moved to the former German army camp, the British Army wanted to give it a new name. They were calling it something like Hone or something like that, H-O-H-N-E. But the people who had been imprisoned at Bergen-Belsen said, no, we want to call it Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp. So they are the ones who wanted to use, I don't know if the idea was they wanted it to be known where they had been, I'm not sure, but they built a community there. They started schools for children, they created newspapers, they created theater, people got married there. In fact, that's where she met her husband and got married just a couple months after she completed her sewing vocational training. Having all of that context made that sentence that had been in the little entry about the sweater and about her, it gave it so much more meaning. And that sentence was, using the unraveled wool of German soldier socks, she fashioned a new life and identity for herself. So she literally took apart those items that represented the people who had been oppressing her, and she created something new with it. It's a beautiful sweater. It is such a cool design. I'll leave links down below to the Yad Vashem article, but also I thanked them for helping me understand the context, and they sent me some more links about so that I could learn more about the DP camp. I learned so much from this, and it was all from this sweater that caught my eye, and I wanted to know more about her story. Last week I was showing you a baby blanket that was in progress that I had started as part of the Martin Luther King Day of Service. The project is called Wrapped in Love, and they provide baby blankets to 3 organizations that serve homeless youth. Oftentimes those homeless youth have babies, and so when they come to these places, they're offered a blanket for their baby. Showing it to you last week when it was in progress. So I used this yarn called Karen Colorama Ogo, or Ogo, and it has 5 different colors that are kind of wound. It's wound like a center pole ball, but then it's like the center pole ball was extended out, stretched out, so that you could see where the 2 colors separated. So if you want to use a very specific amount of any given color, it's easy to find where that transition is and cut it, which is what I did. I wanted to use a specific number of repeats in each color. I decided just to knit them in that order and then have the 5th color be the widest and then go back in reverse. So that's what I did here. So I did about 4 repeats of each color, and then in the center I did 8 repeats. And then again back down to 4 repeats. Now, one of the things I kind of thought might happen, I washed and dried this. It got so much softer when it got washed and dried. The garter stitch border is only 2 stitches. And so it's folding underneath like this, which sometimes happens with garter stitch borders. And that's because the columns adjacent to the garter stitch border are in stockinette. Stockinette wants to roll. And so basically this is actually flipping because you have that very defined line where there's stockinette here and garter stitch here. So the garter stitch isn't rolling, but the stockinette wants to, and so it's causing it to flip. And I kind of thought it might happen, but I didn't feel like trying to do anything about it. I just thought, I'll see what happens. So with acrylic, you can't really block it effectively. It's just going to go into whatever shape it wants to go to. The way you block it is you wash it and dry it in the dryer like I did. But there are some ways that you can force acrylic to keep a blocked shape, and that is by doing what's called killing it. And so you're applying steam to it and it forces it to just stay in that position. You have to be careful because acrylic can melt, but I'm going to try that and see if I can get it to behave anymore. If not, it's just going to be a blanket where the edge turns under. It's going to be wrapped around or, you know, dragged around or whatever anyway. So it's rarely going to be laid out flat and for somebody to comment on. So I'm not too worried about that, but I do want to see if I can improve that a little bit. So I'll probably do that this weekend. I wanted to give an update on my 1940s vintage sweater project. This sweater is part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s. The pattern is called Harlequin. It's from the April 1949 issue of Stitchcraft. And it is worked flat in pieces, bottom up, as many patterns of that era are. And it uses a colorwork technique that's called intarsia, that's also known as color block knitting, or sometimes it's called picture knits, because if you've ever seen like a little kid's sweater that has a big lion's face on it or something like that, it creates a picture. This is a colorwork technique that is completely different from stranded colorwork, as you can see by looking on the back side. And typically it's done by knitting back and forth, which traditionally means you would be knitting it flat. So the first question people have after learning how to do intarsia is, well, how do I do this in the round? And these days, that's even a more common question because so many people are knitting sweaters seamlessly rather than knitting them in pieces and seaming them. There are some ways to end up with something that's tubular that was done in intarsia. In most cases, well, in all cases, you will have to knit back and forth. There are some ways to actually knit in the round and produce color work that is similar to intarsia, or it might even appear to be intarsia from the right side of the work, but it's in fact not intarsia. So those are sort of either hybrid techniques or just techniques that are really quite different. I've had a few people ask me if I have done any technique videos on intarsia or if I'm planning to, and the answer is I have not previously, but I am planning to do some. I sat down and created a list of techniques that either are intarsia or related to intarsia or sort of intarsia adjacent or intarsia similar. And I came up with ideas for 10 different videos potentially. I doubt that I will do 10 videos on this, but it did give me an idea of what there is that I could talk about. I decided to start with duplicate stitch, which is a way of applying small areas of color to finished stockinette fabric. I did that video earlier this week, the Technique Tuesday video, which I'll link to above and below. It's also the method that I use for correcting colorwork mistakes. You can't use the ladder down technique like you can with textured knits. It doesn't work most of the time. It's not going to work for color work to try to ladder down the way you would when you're working with a single color of yarn. So I thought I'd start with that and then do intarsia, and then I might do 1 or 2 other videos at some point in the not too distant future. I'm just not sure which ones are going to be most interesting to me to do. I have to think about that a little bit. So back to this sweater. I had a goal when I started it that I wanted to have 1 sleeve and the back done by the end of January. I knew that I would both want to take a break from it by that time and that I would need to take a break from it. I usually have about a 3 to 4 week tolerance for working on one project before I need to take a break. And I also had plans for February doing Finish It February. And so for Finish It February, I typically don't want to work on current projects. I want to work on old projects and get those off my plate. So I thought that would be good timing, and I really like to put a project to the side at a good ending point. So I wanted to be done with the back, have it off the needles by the end of January. The back is supposed to have 8 triangles. I've got 6.5, so I only have about 1.5 more triangles left, so it shouldn't be any problem to finish this by the end of January. And then I can move on to Finish It February. So you probably won't see anything more about my 1940s sweater until March, when I will get back into it at that point. Finish It February is kicking off on Tuesday, February 1st. If you aren't familiar with Finish It February, it is an opportunity to reduce your UFO pile. UFOs are unfinished objects. So I've been talking about Finish It February each week in January at the end of my Casual Friday podcasts. So if you want to learn more about how to go through your pile of UFOs, how to sort through them, how to decide what to work on first, or how to figure out how to rotate and work on projects where you lose your motivation because they just get boring. I've been giving tips for all of that each week in this past month, and I will leave links to those videos down in the show notes. So I want to kick off Finish It February with a video that I will premiere on Tuesday. And what that means is that you will know ahead of time when it's going to go live. It's not a live stream, but it's a recorded video, but it's going to premiere at a very specific time. And during the premiere, there will be a chat box over to the right, just like there is with live stream videos, and I'll be there, and you can share what you're working on and what you're excited about for February, and that's just to get us kicked off. There is a discussion thread in my Ravelry group, which I will link to down in the show notes, and that discussion thread is devoted to Finish It February. People have been sharing for several weeks now what they're planning on working on, posting photos of things, talking about what they've decided they are finished with, they're never going to work on again, and those kinds of results. And so if you would like to participate in Finish It February in a sort of a group setting, the camaraderie of it, you can join in on that discussion thread, and feel free to post photos of what you're planning on working on or what you've completed. We'd love to see that sort of thing. So I will be creating a second Finish It February thread that will be a no chat thread. And the purpose of that thread will be to post photos of your completed items, things that you've completed in February or fixed in February. Some people use it as a Fix It February challenge. The reason I'm doing that is because at the end of February, I always create a compilation video of the things that people have completed during Finish It February. Each year my channel is bigger and more people participate, and I want to be able to keep on top of what those completed items are as they show up, and I want to have explicit permission to use those photos beforehand. So in the past, I've always gone through and looked at what people have completed, and then I would ask permission, can I use your photos? And sometimes I didn't see my message until too late. It put me in a real time crunch at the very last few days of creating this compilation video. So what I would like to do is give myself opportunity to work on it all the way through February as people finish things. And it will also give me a sense of, do I need to devote a video just to finish it February, or do I need to divide up and do segments in different weeks, just because of the length of time, because I like to give each project enough screen time so people can really see what people have done. If you are okay with me using your photo of your completed item, then you would post that to the no chat thread. And there'll be some instructions about what other kinds of information I would want to know for the purposes of the video as well. In the previous weeks, I've talked about just gathering all your UFOs, figuring out what they are, creating a yay pile of things you're excited about, the nay pile where you're done with them, you don't want to work on them anymore. And then we had this pile of ambiguities. It's like those projects where you don't hate them, but maybe you don't love them. And you're not really sure what to do about them. What I have found is that they just stay at the bottom of the UFO list or pile. At some point, you are either going to go through that pile again, like next February, and your feelings of ambiguity toward that project may change. And they might change because the process of working through UFOs and having a system for doing that, like having a way to get yourself through a large project and figuring out how to rotate things, you learn more about yourself as a knitter. Like, what is it that you like? What kind of variety do you like? What kind of projects do you like? What is it that holds your interest? What is it that loses your interest? And you learn more about yourself so that when you readdress that pile of ambiguity in the future, your feelings toward those objects might change. And so I've had things not change at all. Like, I have one thing I think that's still in my pile of ambiguity. And I think that's just where I want it to be. I don't want to, it's a sock. I don't want to knit the second sock. And I absolutely don't want to throw away the existing sock. So it's just remaining in my pile of ambiguity. But I've had other things. I had 4 or 5 other things in that pile of ambiguity that first year when I was working through all of my, I spent a year kind of going through all my UFOs and having fun with it, and until I got to those things. And then I'm like, okay, I'm done working on UFOs this year. I'm going to start working new projects. And they sat there until 2018, because I spent all of 2016 working on UFOs. 2017 was just all new projects all the time. And then 2018 was the first time I spent the month of February working on finishing things. And so those things came out again. And those 5 things have gradually either moved to the nay pile or the yay pile, except for one sock. And I just keep that sock there. I don't think it will ever go anywhere else. And I'm okay with that. You know, sometimes the reason something is in the ambiguity pile is because you wouldn't mind, you would like the finished thing if it were knit to your skill level that you have now. And maybe you knit something that you really loved, but you weren't skilled enough at it, and you didn't really like the way your knitting was, but you liked the project. And so that can give you mixed feelings about what to do with it. And I'm not going to tell you which way you should feel about it. I did discover one time when I finally thought, you know, it's only going to take me a day to seam up this sweater, and then it'll be done. And so I sat down to seam it up, and I realized the reason I probably put it to the side was because the vertical repeats that were on each piece of the sweater didn't match up. I had knit things based on how long they were and didn't match up row counts after knitting. Like knitting the back to a specific length was fine, but I should have knit the 2 fronts based on the number of rows that I had worked for the back, and that would have caused the 2 fronts to match, and they would have caused the front to match the back. But by the time each piece got up to the shoulder, they were mismatched, and I'm assuming that's why I put it to the side to begin with, and I just couldn't remember it when I first saw that in my UFO pile, because I didn't even remember having knit that sweater. So sometimes you might say, you know what, I'm going to finish that after all, and then you realize, oh, this thing has problems that I do not want to spend that kind of time on. And then it becomes clearly, nope, never going to work on this one again. So sometimes it just takes a while before you even want to attempt to work on it. And then you may quickly decide, oh, nope, I'm tossing this, or I'm putting this knitted piece of fabric back in my stash and making it available for yarn at some point in the future. What I've been talking about in these past few weeks is how to get started on working on your UFOs. In some cases, there might be things where you are stuck on them for reasons that we haven't talked about, and one of those reasons could be grief. It could be that you have UFOs that aren't really your UFOs. They are the UFOs of someone who's died, and you have inherited them, and you're not sure what to do about them at all, how to get through that process or how to approach it. There's a lot of different issues that might surround that. And in other cases, you might be knitting something for somebody and that person has died and you're not sure what to do about it as well. So we'll be talking about a few of those things in the coming weeks. If you have certain situations that in your life, whether they're grief related or some other issue that's causing you to struggle with what to do with a UFO, you can leave those in the Finish It February discussion thread on my Ravelry group, or you can leave those down in the comments below. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday podcast. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.